looks like it's recording. So, it says you've got to be somewhere within 3 lines, that's fine. So, my name is Callum Doswell, and I'm here with Dr. Sharon Brooks, and the date is the 8th of November 2017. She's been kind enough to talk to me about her time here at Hastings College and the 60s and 70s. So, first of all, thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
And so when and where were you born?
When and where was I born?
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. You know where South Dakota is?
I do, yes.
Right north of Nebraska. I was born in Sioux Falls,
Okay.
which is on the eastern part of the state.
Yeah.
And my parents were living in a very, very small town called Centerville. And at the time when I was learning to read, a couple of years after I was born, of course, there was a book, Spot and Puff and Dick and Jane, and they lived in Centerville, so I thought, I was in a perfectly wonderful place when I learned how to read. But Centerville was a very, very small community. My father was a teacher in the high school. My mother was a homemaker.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And what are your parents' names?
G. Albert Bale.
Okay.
And Florine Bale.
What a lovely name. And so, obviously, do you have many siblings or any siblings?
My brother Roger was
Yeah.
born 4 years after and he passed away 7 years ago.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so do you have a large extended family? Any?
I have 19 cousins
Oh, wow.
running around all over the United States.
Okay, that's probably that would be my next
My
question.
father was an only child, but my mother had 4 siblings, and I keep in touch with a large number of my cousins now.
And even though they were spread throughout, do you see them quite often, or did you? See them?
I run into one of them at least once a year,
Okay.
and we always try to plan another reunion and then talk about it and don't do it. But
Yeah.
but a number of us had planned reunions when we were younger, and we did it because our parents kind of gave up the
Yeah.
job, and it was our turn. But now we talk about doing it more. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, this is a bit of an odd question, and I don't know if but what was your earliest memory? Do you have an earliest memory?
Oh, wow. That's the scary part, because we were just talking downstairs with one of my former colleagues about, switching back the tape and going, how far back does it roll? I remember playing mud pies in the backyard with my brother.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember that vividly because my parents reminded me that I lost track of him. And he was younger.
Okay.
And he decided to walk downtown, and I just let him. The town was so small, it was only a block away. But by the time my mom realized my brother had gotten away from me, he was already downtown. But, yeah.
So,
small town.
Did you participate in activities as a child, like maybe at school?
Oh, I'd love to do everything there was to do.
Okay.
We moved a couple of times when I was growing up because my father kept getting larger and larger assignments in schools, and the libraries then in the communities got successively larger.
Okay.
And I used to spend an awful lot of time in the library. My maternal and paternal grandparents were farmers. So my husband thinks I always claim that I grew up on a farm, but it's not true because I never lived on a farm. But every summer I spent most of the time with one of my 2 sets of grandparents.
Okay.
And I like to say I learned to drive a tractor very early on, and shouldn't have been driving it, but and doing all the things that a lot of people think about on a mixed farming background with animals and plants.
Yeah.
One of my grandfathers liked to, what is it called when you take a slip of a tree and attach it to another tree? Oh, I lost the word just now. But he would get a really good strong apple tree, and then he would graft. He would graft other fruits on the tree to see how well they produced. He was a real experimenter.
Oh, wow,
He raised mink.
Oh, really?
Who does that? Yeah, they were mean. We didn't get close to any of these guys. Yeah. And he farmed a little bit. He had a tractor and stuff. But he did the unusual things. The grafting of the fruits. And then my other grandfather was my dad's father, and his idea was to take all the methods that my dad had learned about in college in nutrics and biology, botany, agronomy, and all those things, and then put it to work. He built one of the first shelter belts after World War II and things
Okay.
like that for farming. And he laid a concrete base to feed the pigs as opposed to feeding them in mud. I mean, he tried everything that my dad was trying to teach. And so it was fun to be on a mixed farm.
Yeah, and I suppose the distance between the two is quite
Yeah.
nice as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
Was your father a teacher at your school?
It was a public school.
Okay.
And for some reason that I don't understand, Centerville did not have a kindergarten.
Okay.
Now, the U.S. had those programs almost everywhere, but I went to a nursery school and I didn't go to kindergarten. So we had moved by the time I went to first grade
Okay.
to a large community called Salem. And I went to school there for 3 years, and then we moved to Nebraska. And I became a Nebraskan in the fourth grade, which in our state is the year that you study your state.
Okay.
So it was the perfect time for me to learn about my new state because I just moved here and became absolutely fascinated with it. So my idea of learning history was, of course, reading the books that kids read, Laura Ingalls Wilder and A Lantern in Her Hand and by Beth Streeter Aldrich. Those kind of books that especially the girls liked.
Yeah.
But the Omaha World Herald, the main newspaper that we got, whenever a news story came from anywhere outside of the Omaha area, would print a little map next to the reporter's name at the top of the story. So if you weren't familiar with Nebraska geography, you'd know where that story came from. I just fell in love with newspapers, so I read newspapers like you wouldn't believe because I could learn about my new state.
And did you feel a sense of belonging here after a little while because you just learned about it?
Yeah. So I think about that now and I say that had a huge impact, I think, because I like to read, and in fourth grade you really do get captivated by things that I think that children can go out and touch and see and do, and we did a lot of that through Girl Scouts.
Okay. Yeah.
So we were doing quite a bit of that.
As a child, do you remember the perception of, say, women's issues or any larger issues at the time?
Well, I was the older child in my family, so I kind of did what I wanted to do. I was probably bossy. I'm pretty sure I was. And I know I was when I was in the pre-elementary days because I was a leader of the neighborhood rascals. I mean, if it was time to ride the bicycles, it's because I said it was time. I don't know why I did that, but they were just malleable, I guess. I don't know. And I think I was just adventurous, and they went along with me. And I had the opportunity to do things in the kitchen at Grandma's house, but I also had a chance to go out and feed the pigs and and drive the tractor. So my grandmother didn't drive the tractor; she took care of the garden and the flowers and the rest. But my grandpa didn't mind showing me how to do it. So I think probably I never had a sense that there were girls' chores and boys' chores, but that same grandpa that let me drive the tractor couldn't figure out why you'd want to pay for college for a girl.
Okay. All right.
That didn't come up till way later.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But it really shocked me. And because I was about ready to graduate from high school, and my grandpa said, well, why pay college for a girl? Well, I'd paid for college because I got my scholarships, and so that wasn't a point. And I pretty much went here without my parents having to contribute a lot. Yeah. Now, that's in my remembering, because, of course, when we finally got a car, and I didn't get one until I was a senior, I'm sure that Dad paid the gas. And I didn't pay for the car, so, there were payments. But, that was probably the first time when I, along the line of achievements, where I actually said, I couldn't do it, I shouldn't do it, it isn't my place to do it. That was a shocker. Yeah. That was probably 1969, because I really didn't go to Hastings College until 70. So you're not going to get much from the 60s.
Oh no, that's right. I mean,
no, that's funny. I heard you say that.
And so as a child, do you remember any particular news coverage that stood out to you?
Oh, definitely when I was in sixth grade.
Yeah.
Sixth grade, standing in line to wait to go in at noon, right after lunch, and my house was only a block from the school. Very, very cold, stamping my feet. November 22nd, 1963. We got inside the building, and our teacher wheeled in a television set, which Teachers never did. And we watched the coverage of the shooting of John F. Kennedy.
Of course.
Oh my gosh. And in those days, you got home from school then and you usually watched cartoons. I mean, there was no CNN, there was no news. But there was just constant then on television of everything that was unfolding with that situation. And I talk to my friends now, and we all remember that. Somebody says my parents had given up their TV because the kids watched too much, and then they went out and bought another one. I mean, it was just, it's amazing how changing that event was. And when you're in 6th grade, you're able to understand. You've got some abstract reasoning going on, and it was pretty amazing.
Was it talked about with the teachers at all, or was it just sort of shown to you?
I'm sure we talked about it all the rest of the school year.
And when they finally put the shooter to justice, was that anything that stuck out?
I think we were watching it. I think we saw it live. That's one of the things we talk about now. We say, I can't believe I saw that live. But it was shown live, and we were watching it, and I remember being shocked by it. So I'm pretty sure, it's funny now when you've seen so many replays.
Yeah, of course. Whether
you actually did, but I'm pretty positive that when the whole idea of his identity being revealed, and there were plenty of live cameras there. So yeah, that was amazing.
And so from child to say adulthood or young adulthood, what was that like for you?
Oh,
just in general.
We were a part of the generation. We decided at a couple of reunions that most of the people in our graduating class from high school had older siblings or cousins or relatives who were really involved in the Vietnam situation. And my classmates had numbers for the lottery, but it was 1970 and 68 had happened, and things were. We were probably at that crucible moment of what in the world are we doing? And I remember in my, between my junior and senior year, I went to a National Girl Scout conference in Kent State, Ohio. So I was at Kent State the year before the students were shot. So I'm a senior now, sitting in my social studies class, reading Strawberry Statement. That's a real quirky book about the takeover of the Columbia University school administration. But I had chosen that book to talk about, and the teacher's going, oh, God. I guess we're going to talk about this stuff. But we really did, I mean, in all of our classes. And I remember I knew exactly where those students were when they were shot because I had been on that campus. Well, I was the only one in the entire high school that ever been to that campus because I'd been at some quirky Girl Scout conference. And in those days, most of us didn't stay in Scouts that long, but there was a corps of us who had decided to do that and get the last final activity things that we did. So this was a national jamboree conference kind of thing in communication. And people from the Students for Democratic Society, the SDS, and they were right there on the panel telling us about what our freedoms were and why they were out protesting. Even members of a couple of organizations that I can't remember now who were not necessarily nonviolent.
Yeah, okay.
And these little Girl Scouts, juniors in high school, are sitting there listening to these people going like this. You know, it was amazing. So it was very much a part of my sophomore, junior, and senior year. Yeah.
When you were here, how open was the teaching towards sort of radical ideas? And
I think it was wide open.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons I came here. Yeah. I had no reason to believe that other places weren't, but I knew through, I think I could probably say this, but I can't pinpoint anything. I had really great youth directors in our Presbyterian church.
Okay.
And we went to a couple of black churches in Kansas City and worshiped with them on a weekend a couple times in my junior and senior year because our youth director knew that we didn't know any black people. I mean, they didn't live in Fremont. But they were Christians and we were Christians, and they really wanted us to get a sense of, what the world was all about. So we did. There were fires in Omaha. There were places that were burned. So right down the road, we knew that there was a problem. And interestingly enough, I don't know how we got this wild, crazy idea, but one of our classmates, our senior year, was probably one of the first black students to go to Fremont High. I don't know that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But his father was an officer at a camp near Scribner, Nebraska, which was sort of like Hastings and Harvard, down the road, because they had a similar facility there. His dad was stationed there, so they decided to live in Fremont. And we found out from him, I don't know how, but some of us, that their family couldn't find a house to live in Fremont.
Oh, really? No, they couldn't buy it?
That the closest place that anybody would allow them to purchase a house was in Omaha. And they didn't want to move to North Omaha, which is the places where most of the black folks live, because it was in the middle of a racial situation. And they were kind of surprised by the whole thing. And oh boy, did we. We protested. We threatened a walkout. This is in school, and our principal says, we have nothing to do with the fact, but we just really went berserk. And we formed an entire different student association. I had been a secretary for my class, and there was a separate student body president, and that group, I don't know whether I was class secretary or not, but anyway, we formed a group called the Forum. And what we wanted to do then is bring students literally into a place like, I don't know, Hazel Ridge Student Union, and bring in a speaker and have that speaker explain why in Fremont our friend and his family couldn't get out. And so we set up some of that, and I think it drove our superintendent absolutely wacko. I mean, the students I ran around with a couple of them were college presidents' kids, so I think we felt pretty fearless. I mean, we were going to get kicked out of school, but we wanted the answers. Yeah. And I think they were scared to death that, they'd get bad publicity, or, Fremont would look bad. But that was our point. Yeah. If our friend's family couldn't get a house in Fremont, what was wrong with Fremont? Yeah. So, if you're up on the news, Fremont's still having trouble, but that's a whole other problem. Yeah.
So
that kind of shook the tree a little bit.
It's alongside that. So was that sort of when you were aware you wanted to become sort of involved in sort of activism and organising?
Well, yeah. I don't think we feared it very much.
No.
We didn't fear any repercussions. I was the high school newspaper editor, and we wrote almost about anything we wanted to. Mostly because our competitors at the contests from Omaha were writing about things like that. Okay. Women's issues. In my class, for example, if you became pregnant and you were female, you were not in school anymore. And I think that's probably happened throughout history, that young ladies would get pregnant, but we were paying attention to it and saying, what? And part of this is that we'd read an editorial maybe in a contest that had come from a large city newspaper, and then we tried to get it in ours, and our poor advisor would say, she just put her head on the table and said, this is Fremont, it's not Omaha. Because it'd be like the difference between New York City and Hastings. It's like, I don't know, we don't talk about stuff like that here. But we were aware of it. I don't think we got real brave about stuff like that the year I was editor, but I think they got into big trouble the next year.
Oh, really?
Because we spawned a whole bunch of really wild writers. They were good.
That's a good thing.
They were good, and they took the risk.
Yeah.
But our advisor only lasted one more year, and then she left. But it was kind of that edge of times when we could make a little bit of noise, and we knew it was happening in colleges. But we're 16 and 17, and they're 20 and 21. In those days, that's a huge gap. Yeah. Yeah.
So when were you aware, and how did you sort of transition into the media?
Well, I came here for journalism and English, and in those days, you did that if you were going to teach English or teach journalism.
Okay.
And there were a bunch of us that realized, based on Washington Post coverage of Watergate and the impact of the media during the war coverage, you know, how important CBS was to exposing Vietnam. And we read a lot of media and watched a lot of it. We thought it could make a difference. So our campus media were really pretty active, and I'd love to talk to Brian and more about when he was talking about the women's issues. I said, I think the collegian back then was a little different than it is now. And I was even surprised when I talked to my friends about how much the class ahead of me or the students in McCormick Hall working in the basement on the collegian, how many things we questioned. We questioned our entire curriculum here at Hastings College, and we were surprised to find out that during the time we were here and graduated, the personalized program was developed. The group of people just said, we have some power to ask why and how. And it kind of amazed me how that kind of worked out. Because it was, at that time, it was pretty local.
Yeah.
I was never interested in taking over a building. That wasn't my style. I think most of us were, in fact, what was interesting about it is music and art and theater were very strong aspects of expression.
Yeah.
And if they, you know, if the music of the folk singers, the art that was, the posters that were being created and some of the plays that were being written, I mean, they had huge impacts, I think, on us. And our arts faculty here was just as open to challenging ideas. I think we had a pretty heads-up chaplain. Mm-hmm. And the year before I came, they actually did have a candlelight vigil in Hartwell Park to protest the war. It was pretty quiet, but I think it made all the law enforcement people scared, because their only ideas of a bunch of college kids getting together was not really something they wanted to have happen. But because it was Hastings College, and because I think the kids were motivated by peace, it was a very memorable experience. I can't remember if my senior year or junior year, we had a hunger walk, 20 or 25 miles. I mean, this was, I think back on that now, I go, okay, a couple miles around Hartwell for crop is great, but I thought, why in the world did we think 20 miles was necessary? But we did. And so there was a lot of that kind of thing going on. And we just kind of, I think it evolved over the opportunity to do it. The literature we read, I mean, we read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee.
Dee Brown.
Yeah, and the book about My Lai Massacre. I mean, those were parts of our literature, contemporary literature. So you can't read that stuff and not ask some questions.
Naturally. Yeah. I know it's some years apart, but between Leicester and Hastings, can you compare the dialogue that the students had with, say, the faculty there? That's just more of a personal question of interest.
Well, I never had any undergraduate courses, so I'm not helping you out very much. But the crowd that I was learning from at the graduate level were really big into Marxist thought. And they confronted, my American, free market economy. Yeah. And of course, the BBC was stronger than ITV or any of those at the time. And our system of funding broadcasting was kind of flip-flopped. Mm-hmm. Most of our television, obviously, and radio was commercial. And then we had this little sliver of non-commercial over here. And of course, BBC was huge and non-commercial. But that was in transition when I went over. So studying the impact of the media in terms of words like hegemony, and colonialism, and neo-colonialism, and all that was, that was happening. And they were not a very activist group at the time, but of course, James Halloran had been, because he and Sean McBride did this whole thing at UNESCO, and Ronald Reagan came in a few years later and wanted to yank the United States out of UNESCO and the United Nations, because he didn't want anybody in any country telling American media what to do. And I thought, boy, you haven't read anything, have you, about what we tend to show as imagery of Nigeria in the United States, unabashedly not allowing anybody from Nigeria to create that cultural image. And of course, we do the same with the Brits. I mean, what my master's thesis was on the access to the people who were a part of the Margaret Thatcher administration.
Okay.
And I interviewed American correspondents, because I had access through my media background to all our network people. And then I interviewed BBC people, and not as many print people, because I was more interested in the immediate. And at those days, the big deal was satellites. We didn't have live coverage from overseas unless somebody had a really, 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 really good story that could be told live. And ABC was always in third place in those days. They had decided to have a 3-anchor situation, and one of the anchors was overseas. And so a man by the name of Peter Jennings was actually the anchor for the ABC 6 o'clock news in London. And one of the things that all the networks were realizing at that time is that if you're in London and you're controlled by what the Brits and their colonial empire think of what's happening in Africa, for example, you're not getting the whole story. And yet they couldn't convince any of their corporate folks back in New York to put correspondents in Nairobi or even anywhere. And they used to brag about how proud they were that they had 2 people in South America. In the entire continent, and you're 28 years old going, what? How in the world are you covering an entire continent, But all of that just burst open when you're in 70s covering all the things that were happening. And you begin to realize when our President Nixon goes to China that my mom and dad were going, oh, China, yeah, it exists. And I'm going, what? It takes a presidential visit and all that to get you. Well, yeah, to focus, because they came out of World War II. Their focus had been Europe and to some extent Japan. My dad was in the South Pacific, so that was a pretty big deal. But the incredible impact 1 or 2 choices for an editor would make on our view of Margaret Thatcher, for example, or for Jane Callahan, But I was there when they had the election, so I got to interview people, and it was good.
How interesting. So, during the time, was there any particular, I know we talked about some things, but any real particular media coverage that really, really struck out to you in your mind? 3 Mile Island happened when we were there. Yeah? It was a huge nuclear explosion in the United States. Yeah. So I got a chance to see how it was covered. And I think there was a huge reaction by the British media. Of course, the other thing that happened over there is the New York Times, or the London Times went on strike, which was like the headache of the world if you're a journalism student. But it was interesting to see what people started reading when the Times wasn't there. The Guardian was there. The Telegraph, obviously, and I think at that time the Guardian was pretty left and the Telegraph was pretty right. Yeah. But the Star and the Sun became really popular that year. That's what we have to blame for it. And I thought, interesting that with the Times gone, that those two would become so popular. Well, they took some risks because they had a chance. Yeah. Plus the fact that I was very well aware that part of why the Times was not publishing was a strike, and that folks, I think in Europe, were well aware of the change to the dependence on broadcasting for information, and the media. Of course, radio had been strong in Britain
for a long, long time. But the press itself, as the physical manifestation of how things got to people, was going to be changing. And I think the press people wanted a part of that, and they were sort of kept as journeymen over on the side. And of course, right after that, the American media started facing the same thing. And I took my students to a conference in St. Louis in the mid-'80s, and we were sitting across the table from a fairly new editor-in-chief at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, really big, well-known newspaper. And I just casually said, when he walked in and met the students, I said, well, where you been today? What have you been doing? What's the news? And he said, I will tell you. He said, we learned today that we could buy a computer and put it on the kitchen table of every one of our readers in the entire St. Louis area for the cost of a new press.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And this is in the mid-'80s.
Yeah. That's...
And you know what computers are like in mid-'80s? There's these boxy, big, horrible things. And it was beginning to really, I think that whole revolution to digital, Negroponte shift, if you've ever heard of that, the MIT folks saying we've gone from atoms to bits.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, was happening. So I was sort of aware of that generally when I was aware of the impact, and my thesis was on access. And if you, in fact, I had to fight to get the title, Putting Up the Bird, because they called the satellite a bird. And if you had a story that was worthy putting up the bird, that meant you could go live. It was hard to get that unless it was a disaster.
Yeah.
But it was hard to do a disaster because the equipment was so cumbersome yet.
To get it there.
That, you couldn't be where anything was really interesting to look at. So a lot of the disaster stuff was not necessarily live yet. But to say that you were in London when Thatcher was, Erin Eve, her close associate politically, was assassinated when I was in London. I mean, I was down at the Tate Museum, and it happened at Westminster. It was like my mother calls and goes, "What?" And I'm going, "Well, yeah." And Mountbatten was killed.
Yep.
So the IRA was busy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if something like that happened, it was worthy of putting up the bird. But you'd be standing in front of Westminster, and I think the car blew up behind. Yeah. But you were there because it was a moment in time and the impact of strategic terrorism. But yeah, it was all about who has the era producer in New York. Susan Peterson, a CBS correspondent in London, said, I had 13 stories ready to go about the Thatcher revolution. I mean, essentially, she brought a conservative political thing, I'll call it a thing, political purview to the forefront. But she also was the first one, at least they were saying it then, to advertise herself like soap. Yeah. In other words, she was using an American media campaign to be elected. But as I figured out over there, you don't elect her, you elect all the folks who then, her party then makes her. So it's a lot more complex than just simply having one big Donald Trump campaign. And there was a lot of criticism of using her brand, as we now call it, as the focus for an election like you would a Reagan or a, and that was huge. But I learned that British folks could get access to her news conferences fairly easily, but there was really a lot of jockeying if you were not a part of the British media to be in the room. So when our folks decided that she was an important person to pay attention to, Susan Peterson said, well, we had 13 different stories lined up to help the American public understand the rise of Margaret Thatcher's political power. And until a poll came out, she couldn't get any of them on the air at night for anything. Really? And then one thing happened and they wanted everything. Wow. And she couldn't get enough of them. You know, they'd say, well, you got 13, we want 20.
Yeah.
And it was just like that. But that's because at that time they began to have access because the Thatcher folks wanted America to understand what was happening. And if you had no way to get that microphone in front of anyone who had any power, let alone the Prime Minister herself, you didn't have a story. So that was what my thesis was about, the power of access. And it's fascinating now when you think about all the people who are said to be too cozy with the people they cover.
Yeah.
I mean, you probably grew up in an era where you thought, of course.
Yeah. It's second nature.
They only got their job because they went to college with him or something.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that might be true.
We always get told it's who you know, not what you know.
Yeah. And I think about that time, they begin to realize that you can't send a really, really good reporter over there if that reporter doesn't have any
tie.
Yeah.
Out of interest, how was being a female head of state or female leader of government? How was that received over here?
Oh, I think it was pretty amazing. I think Indira Gandhi and Golda Meir were about in that age. And for, of course, those of us over here, it was like, and when is that going to happen? I had interviewed some people who were very open-minded about it when they ran for the presidency in 1976 because the primary for the Democratic Party was pretty wide open. And Jimmy Carter won the nomination, but there were a lot of candidates, and many of them were pretty open-minded about that. There were no serious females, but Shirley Chisholm, a black woman from the East Coast, was on the ballot, and she actually spoke at Hastings College a few years ago.
Really?
It was really fun to get to meet her again because I had interviewed her when she was a part of the politics staff then. And long shot.
Yeah.
But it was, and those of us who were thinking about it seriously and wondering about it, we were just happy to get a woman. Well, when I came to Hastings College, Lincoln had a female mayor, and Nebraska had Kay Orr as governor. She was on our board of trustees.
Really?
Yeah. So women were making inroads at that level, but there was really no serious talk at the national level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you had to summarize, say, the 70s, or your experience of the 70s here, and just in Nebraska and America, how would you do so?
Oh gosh. I had the privilege to cover a lot of stories when I became a television news director. So we had a small enough station here in Hastings that they needed a lot of reporters to just get everything done. And I worked my tail off after I got a full-time job just doing anything and everything that needed to be covered in the standard newsroom. But there were a lot of things happening with the bicentennial in 1976, and then, of course, the election of a female governor and things like that I had a chance to talk to some really interesting people. And when I was in college, a number of my friends, I think, were involved in what we now know as, it was women's health and... I can't think of the name of the organization. I'll think of it when in the middle of something else here. But it actually set up clinics for women with needs for contraception. Planned Parenthood. There we go. I knew it would come to me. And I was talking to a couple of friends the other day that were doing the story that Brian was doing, and they said, I remember taking my roommate down to Planned Parenthood to get some contraceptives. And I can remember she said if her mom had ever known that I gave her a ride to get contraceptives, she would never have talked to me, and I never would have been at her wedding, Really? So anybody who is, some of my friends were actually volunteering at that time, but then others, nobody would tell their mother and father, that they were sexually active or thought they might be, and that was a major thing in college. And then it became an incredible issue when we were doing news coverage. Yeah.
Do you feel like that's changed a lot? Especially the issues of Planned Parenthood in this state. I mean,
well, I think it's become political hot potato because of the connection to not necessarily the contraceptive side, but what happens if a woman becomes pregnant and the rights she has to decide what happens. Yeah, I think that. Yeah.
And do you feel like women's issues or the women's movement from when you were here to now? How do you feel that's evolved? Maybe both on campus and...
Well, some of us think that some people in 2017 have taken a lot for granted.
I can imagine so.
You know, because when I got my first credit card, for example, my dad had to sign it, and I was 22 years old. And then within a year, the credit rules were changing because buttons were being pushed. And so when I went back to get it renewed, I wasn't going to have my dad sign it. And they said, well, we have to have proof that you're able to pay your bill. And I said, I have a full-time job. I'm a television reporter. Well, who's your husband? No, I don't have one of those, So then I took it down to a bunch of us. There was a really small group in Hastings that were a part of what we call the National Organization of Women. And we decided to get these new credit cards, and then we go down and sign up at like JCPenney's and all these kinds of places, and then refuse to do anything more than give them our own credit record. And then if they said, well, you have no credit record, I said, well, my friend who's next to me in the desk just got his job too, so what kind of credit record does he have to offer you? Well, because your dad signed this or your husband? No. So it was one right after another, and we just put it all together and thought it was a hoot. We just got together, and that's kind of how we were rebelling in Hastings, just by informing people.
Drawing attention.
But of course, the media have been doing that too with things like the open meetings law that said I have a right to be at this meeting because it's a meeting of elected officials or appointed officials doing the business of the community or the political entity. And we had to do some of that with them, saying, I'm here. Well, why are you here, Sharon? Well, because I'm a reporter, and I'm reporting on something that's happening in Hastings. Well, we really don't want everybody to know about this. I said, well, then you can't vote on it because you can talk about it in private, but you can't vote on it and take action in secret. So I was already doing it there, and some of us then were. It was mostly a public information campaign. And we weren't out to mess up the life of the retailers in town. We were just there to say, hey, we're people who have economic value and we have full-time jobs and we intend to keep them. A lot of my friends were teachers or librarians, but a lot of them were in the media or in finance. And they're all retiring now, which is a hoot, because I'm seeing what's happening with all these business women who've had their companies over the years. Yeah. And they could tell you lots of stories too. But yeah, we were just testing it because it was already, by that time the fight had been fought. Brian heard about Title IX, and that was 72, and I was in college at the time. So then after that, what happened? What did we do to make use of it?
Yeah.
And most of my friends at reunions would say, well, I was the first one at my college to play basketball, or I was the first one at my college to play volleyball, because they were juniors or seniors when it was passed. And the college either did or didn't, slept through the next 2 years or tried to figure out whether they had any women who were interested. It was a watershed time. Yeah.
How aware were you of the national situation at the time?
Oh, very aware.
Yeah.
Yeah. Through the media, we paid attention.
Yeah.
When I was a junior in college, I had decided that the only media wasn't just print, and the only thing to do with journalism wasn't just teach. So there were a number of us who decided that an English degree was great, and a journalism degree I could get at that time was great, but I might want to do it because I want to be a reporter, not a teacher. And I still got my teaching certificate, but I wanted, there's that old thing that says if you can do, if you can't teach, and somehow that hit me. So I decided that before I taught, I wanted to be a journalist, and so I wanted to get internships. between my junior and senior year in college, then I did a lot of interviewing all over the place. Omaha, Lincoln, Grand Island, Hastings. And everyone in broadcasting said, you've got a great set of clips from your college newspaper. But we've got to tell you that our listeners and our viewers just aren't ready to take the news from a female. They, Walter Cronkite and all those guys were, and they had authority and all this. But we just don't think that you've got, this high-pitched voice you're going to have. No, I don't have a high-pitched voice, okay. So I didn't get any internships. And in any of those areas, but I got on with a small newspaper in Omaha and did a lot of advertising. You had to sell advertising for them before you could write a news story because they had to make the money before they got. So I came back from my summer of my getting into my senior year, and my phone started ringing because a young lady by the name of Jane Pauley had gone on the Today Show, and she was a big hit on NBC. And now the NBC affiliate here didn't know anybody else in the whole place. They'd gone through yearbooks, they'd gone through the Miss Nebraska contest list, and because it was beauty. Yeah. And they couldn't find anybody. But they remembered that there was this person from Hastings College, and they couldn't find my resume, so they invited me in. And I was not a homecoming queen. I mean, there was nothing about my appearance that would have been a Jane Pauley. But I could write, and I could speak well, thanks to some really good people here. And they took a chance on me. So I was the weather girl my senior year. Yeah. And I do emphasize girl. It was weather girl. And I got to do the 6 and 10 o'clock weather. And I was really bad because I looked like a little girl. Yeah. But that was cute. So cute worked. But then they realized I was learning a lot about meteorology because I had been calling the folks at the Grand Island Weather Service to get all the information. And I wouldn't just get information about the temperatures and the barometric pressure and that, but I'd ask them all kinds of questions about weather. Mm-hmm. And so I could do that on my newscast or my weathercast because I was a good learner. Mm-hmm. And they respected me because I didn't say anything that was stupid. Yeah. At least I tried not to. I mispronounced some names. It was pretty funny, pretty typical. But the key there was that we had no teleprompters. Okay. So I had to memorize it or put it up on a poster board like the size of that wall because I think I was the first person in Hastings to get soft contacts, for example. Okay. Because somebody decided that I probably could have looked more authoritative with these glasses, but you look a little prettier without them. So, so then you've got hairdressers and all these people trying to make me look better. And it worked for a while. But I was just taken aback by all that attention, and I was just trying to do serious weather. How come how serious can you be about weather, really? But they let me do stories on weekends. Mm-hmm. So, have you met Chris Shukai yet? Chris is in the admissions and marketing here. Mm-hmm. His father was the director of the news when I was there. And he and I would say, well, gosh, if you go over to cover a story about birds that are dying at the Wilcox Marsh, wouldn't it be nice to have the sound of the birds and the environment in the interviews and then just show the birds? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, all we had film for at the time was you could show the interview and then you could show the birds, but you can't show them at the same time. Sure. And I looked at him and I said, well, I know about magstripe. He goes, you do? And I said, well, yeah. He goes, well, I do too. And he said, but nobody around here uses it. And I said, well, can we try it? So we put the first voiceover on a channel. I could win friends then with the technical folks because they liked doing the tech. And I liked to think that it made a better story. And you could in a little station. It would have taken a month of Sundays to do it at a big station, because it would have had to go through a whole bunch of other hoops. But we got a chance to do some things and try some things that they had never done. And it was a wonderful place then to work and learn and do new things. And I obviously make mistakes. Mm-hmm. But it was a small enough market, and the people here were nice enough that I ended up doing the farm market news, and if our director had laryngitis, they'd wake me up at 4 a.m. and say, Sharon, come in and do the farm report. And they'd put up with me. And Dutch Woodward was a grizzled old 75-year-old with this, voice from like the basement. And I've got a really wonderful picture of him giving me a hug on the set. And he says, he basically said, if I'm not here, she can handle it. Well, that's nice. Okay. I did the sports if the sports person was gone, because they needed somebody to do the sports. And I like sports, so that was fine. I didn't anchor very often because we had plenty of people whose primary brand, was the station. But they let me try things. I think they were seeing how it worked. Yeah. And I was developing a little bit of a sense of trust. If I got the joke was you don't always get the weather right, but I wasn't the one. I was giving the weather that the folks who knew about the weather were giving, so I could claim to be reporting it accurately, but not because I'm the one who read the charts. The stories that I did were relevant and good, but abortion was huge. Really? And one of the people that I worked for at the time just simply said, we're not doing any stories at Channel 5 about abortion. And I said, well, everybody's talking about the Supreme Court decision, and it's a big issue in town. He goes, but I don't want to handle it. He said, I don't agree with it. And he said, and I can't handle it by talking to people who do support it, so we're not going to put it on. So I learned, you people who have the power make the choices about what stories you do. And that changed over the years, obviously, because part of it is it's not just a he said, which was pretty much all it was back then. But there were other nuanced aspects of it. And as a young woman, I could identify with the nervous young women who didn't want to tell their parents, et cetera, et cetera. But nobody was going to talk to me on air about that. No. Parents wouldn't talk, kids wouldn't talk. But you could get stories, you could put that together with good scientific research and polls and sociological information was coming out. And you could build a story about the necessity for federal funding for something that was kind of touchy. Mm-hmm. And you could still write it with a sensitivity, if you will, for religious beliefs and some other things. But there were a lot of people who simply said, you can do that at the network level, but you can't do it here. Okay. And there were some people who said, yeah, you can do it here. And I think some print people were doing a pretty good job of it. But there were some topics relative to education, too. This whole balance of, I'm a football player. Why in hell do I have to share any of my income for the maintenance of my football field with a bunch of girls over here who want to play whatever? Yeah. Why do I have to raise money during volleyball season when it's their job as the pep club to sell popcorn to support my postseason? That stuff was going on. I was very proud to be a pep club officer when I was in high school, but that's because that's what girls did. They didn't play sports. But pep clubs kind of went away over those years, those 10 years, because the girls and the women found a place on the field and on the court. And that was all happening. So you got in cover stories like that. And there were Nancy Kindig, I remember her. She's now, I think she's in Geneva. I think they might have just moved to Texas. But she was one of the first young ladies in Hastings to break records in track. And if I remember correctly, she broke a bone in the final race at the state tournament and won it. And so that was a story Sharon got to cover, because Nancy's a girl and you can go cover her. Well, then I got to meet a whole bunch of incredibly cool women because give that story to Sharon. And so I did. It was neat. But I met some pretty cool guys too, so that was
from that level. Where did you go from there in terms of like newscasting?
I became news director in 1976, and when I went to a national convention the next year in '77, there were 11 of us at the national convention that could be identified as either radio or television news directors. I'm pretty sure there were probably more, but we were amazed. But there were 11 out of the entire country. So we kind of hung out. And it was interesting because I was naive enough to be sitting there at a table, one of the awards dinners, and I talked to the head of a major newsroom from one of the larger cities, and I said, and tell me about your wife and her interest in all this. And back in those days, guy news directors went to conventions to make contacts with anybody and everybody but their wives. So it's like dead silence. Because I thought, well, you're it's either going to be the news director from your staff or it's going to be your wife for this evening. And you know, she was just a lady that, and I realized that this is a whole different world that I knew about. Mm-hmm. And I did some crazy things. I went to awards dinners with our management and realized that a couple of times, you know, I don't know, a day later or a week later, when they said to all their guy friends after we'd had our cocktail after dinner, well, we're leaving now. That said one thing to the guys, and it said another thing to me.
Yeah.
And he and I had gone to a friend's house. There were a whole bunch of people who had been a part of a story we had done. And we went over to their house, and it was a mixed group. But to the guys, it was like, I got my gal for the night. And I thought, oh, shit. Because that's not me, you know. And you get to that point, you go, oh, okay, you know. But he had to keep some sort of, I guess, reputation.
Yeah.
And he knew I wasn't going to do what they thought I was going to do. But, oh my God, how long did it take me to figure that out, you know? Even talking about it now makes me embarrassed. But this was a person who had hired me and was supportive because he had 4 daughters. Mm-hmm. And I think he realized that he could do that because he understood that he would be trusted by his peers to pick a competent person. And also then he had to play that game of, well, she's really here because.
Yeah.
It was maddening.
Yeah.
But got over that. The biggest change that I encountered then when our news broadcast became very successful and got a lot of attention and then became really a good sale for the station, was that they brought in a promotions team then to promote it. And what they wanted me to do to promote the station was not real serious journalism stuff. And I knew enough about my appearance to know I could improve it and I could do this, but I wanted the news, the product, to be it. So when I left the station, the idea was to go back to graduate school and understand marketing so that I could go back and do a good job doing news and then market myself or my own, my staff, as opposed to hiring somebody else to apply a certain criteria of what would appeal. Because it used to make me madder than heck.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And I thought, no, if I know news and I know the industry, so I'm going to go back to school and learn marketing. And that was my plan. But I ended up studying mass media instead, so it changed. But
interesting.
That was the transition.
At the time, did it actually feel like things were changing?
Oh, yeah.
As you were transitioning, could you really feel...
Oh, yeah. There were more and more women. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, I got together with some friends because one of my friends' husbands actually retired. And Karen was doing publicity for a station in Lincoln at the time. And she was the first person to actually have that job to do public service announcements. And then our other friend, Linda, was actually doing the weather. She was hired about the same time I was, and she did the weather at a station in Lincoln. So we've become friends over the years, and we've watched, things change. Yeah, and it happened more and more and more. It just took off after that.
So do you think your outlook was changed by being involved both with women's issues and journalism in general, just from as you sort of looked through it?
I could see the change because it was part of the news awareness that we had, the things that made it on Associated Press wire and the things that didn't. I knew early on that if you tried to put something on UPI or AP, we were mostly AP. If you gave them a story, what the criteria was for getting it out there. Mm-hmm. And then if we sent stories from the closed circuit NBC feeds, what it took to get on, in that day it was regional Chicago, and what it took to get on Chicago. So I could see the stories that they were offering for regional use that weren't on the network. And it was a growing, involvement of people to get a voice. I definitely think there was the changing culture. I mean, there were a lot of people who came from Vietnam, mm-hmm. and they became visible in lots of places all over our country where people of Asian descent had been here for years. But their story became incredibly important because we had been a part of a war, and most of them had come here because their lives were threatened because of their association with the U.S. So I saw those stories unfolding. The American Indian movement was huge. And I remember going to do a story in Omaha because there was a powwow that was called because of the birth of a white buffalo. And it was really important to the Sioux culture. And I had interviewed a chief from the Ponca Nation who had been in Hastings for some reason. And again, I got the job because whatever. And I wasn't high pressure in my interviews, which was frustrating for me because sometimes you really do have to get something done in 3 seconds or 3 minutes or whatever else. But I would usually talk to my interviewees quite a bit more than most other people because I wanted to make sure when the question was asked, it got, if you're going for a soundbite, get a good one. But I had met him, and when I went to the powwow then outside of Omaha at the Douglas County Fairgrounds, a really well-regarded, high-intensity woman out of the Omaha stations came out, and she just, she came with her crew, and I had like one camera person at that time, and when she arrived, she expects something to be happening because she'd been told. I mean, you said you're going to be here, and you're here. Well, I knew enough about it that I wasn't going to control that situation. And I also knew that Native people kind of gather. They don't, tell you on your cell phone that, there's a buzzer that goes off. And I had come from out of town, and I was on my station's nickel too, but I knew, and my administrators knew that I was going to be there for the day. And it might take half the day for anybody to arrive. Well, she came barging into this group of people that finally gathered madder than heck because she had a deadline, and by God, she told them she was going to be there. And, this kind of thing. And she stuck the microphone and then asked the key question, about the significance of the gathering. And this older man, this very well-respected man, had not been respected by that behavior, and he just refused to speak. And all she could do is get frustrated and demand of the people who were kind of setting this thing up. Well, they had reverence for him because he was an honored person, and I knew it. But after she flustered herself and went off and did a stand-up someplace else, I got one of these jesters, and I got an interview with him. Well, I had patience, but I understood that this was a clash of cultures. Mm-hmm. And by even being there and doing that story, it was probably more than that station had ever done. Mm-hmm. But you just couldn't apply that sort of, know who I am, it's important that I'm here, my crew has better things to do than sit around here all day and wait for you guys to all arrive. And I came all the way from Hastings, and I got to get a story, and I'm going to have to get a story in a way that's likely to get a decent result, because if I go back to Hastings with about as much as she got, it was not going to work. And I'd already learned a little bit about the fact that if you show respect and appreciation, then you're not, there was something that they had told me in an interview about especially the older generation felt that a photo was actually a part of their persona, and you would be taking part of their personality. And so I didn't even have a camera with the first time we talked, until we talked about the fact that this would be important to the folks who wanted to learn about their culture and the Buffalo and the reason they got together, and then I got permission. But I still understood I was doing something that it was painful for this person, because I was taking an image that was a part of his very being with me, and she had no clue about that.
No,
but I was only lucky because I'd had a chance to cover it, and I was outstate, so we had more Native people than they did. Yeah, but that was a really big deal for me.
Yeah.
That was a cool moment.
That's very interesting. Were there any particular issues that were really prominent here on campus during your time here, or even when you were just you were aware of?
Well, we figured out that curriculum was huge. We wanted a chance to have more choice, and we were surprised when we went back and read some of those same articles about the student government reaction to women's hours. That we were chided for saying, well, you're really here to be a student first, not to be an activist. So a bunch of people said, okay, then here's our 10-point plan on how to change the curriculum. Oh, okay. And I was talking to my friend Melody, and she said, "God, we kind of took it on, didn't we?" And I said, "Well, I had forgotten that part, but the personalized program came apart, and then the new core courses for students came, and I think a lot more of us in 73, 74, and probably in 75 after we left, tried these internships or tried medical school or dental school or law school, and probably wouldn't have maybe 5 years earlier.
Okay.
And then a lot of women went into business, and in ways that probably even our high school counselors wouldn't have thought of. I mean, a woman going into business in 1964, 65, 66 would have been good typing skills and shorthand, which my mother had. She was an executive secretary for a school district before she got married, and then of course she quit, because in 1951, of course you quit. I never thought about quitting. My generation didn't think about quitting. We didn't know how long we'd stay in our job, and many of my friends chose to have families and leave a career, or leave it briefly, or whatever. Yeah, it messed up the guys entirely. I mean, think of the guys in the 70s then who looked at their dad's experiences as a family man. And they're competing now for jobs that women are competing for, and it's sort of expecting the same salary. We're still not. And they're thinking, well, yeah, but my job is to be like my dad and support a family and have a house and all that kind of stuff. And I'm competing against this person who has nothing better to do than buy clothes. I mean, the attitudes they might have had. And there was this great commercial I was thinking about as I drove over here. There was this, and we alluded to it all the time, this beautifully svelte woman would come zooming into the home in a business suit and a bag, a briefcase, and say, "I'm bringing home the bacon and then cooking it up too." And that was just a tagline for everything. So a lot of us thought, well, yeah, we can do it all. Nobody can do it all. But that went on for a number of years.
Did you see it affecting the young men around you, say in your years at here? Was there some pushback? Or?
If you read the research that one of my friends did, she actually interviewed a bunch of the guys that happened to be in Bronx Hall. And they said, well, if we applied the same rules to your hours as they are to men, they go, well, of course not. I mean, I'm responsible for myself. I can come in after 10:30 or whenever I want. And you're never going to get us to do what the girls have to do. Well, hello. Well, the kind of charm of all that was when I was a freshman, the guys who could stay out would serenade, believe it or not. They would come and we'd all, throw our windows open and they'd sing really beautiful, kind of fun songs like "I Love You Truly," and then they'd sing some naughty ones, and then the dorm mother would come push them away. But there was a bit of charm in that. Well, it wouldn't happen unless they knew all the women were in and attentive. So there was a bit of charm to that. Yeah. Well, now if we all kind of hang out and we go our ways, then what's the charm in singing to the girls in the dorms? Well, it's not there. So I think they were working through a lot of it, but when you look at the people who were on the staff of the Collegian newspaper, it was a mix. Mm-hmm. We went back and looked over that. We had some female editors and male editors, and the head of the student association when I was a senior is just retired as a judge in Grand Island, and he wrote some incredibly forthright prose, which is probably why you did really well in law school, to the board of trustees, and he was speaking on behalf of the women because this wasn't a guy issue. At least not directly, but there were an awful lot of women who thought that it was stupid that we had to be in, and the guys didn't. And we had a symposium. I think Melody talked about that our senior year and brought in a lot of female speakers. And the guys were out there raising money to bring them in just like the rest of us. So I think they saw it as again, we have an opportunity, a sense to... We're learning about this in political science class. We want to see if it works. Yeah. We're learning about it in terms of new social science research on some of the things we thought were true before aren't like divorce rates. Mm-hmm. It's scary to see what happened over between 50 and 2000. Yeah. But I don't think you can blame that on social movements so much as they were beginning to realize that there are a lot of bad connections and expectations and all that was going on. And the guys were facing the same sorts of challenges. Yeah. I can't say that I know enough about everything. No, but they were in it with us. Yeah, see, that's good. That's interesting to hear.
Are you still? Would you say you're still active within, say, women's issues or journalism?
Well, I read a lot about journalism now, and I read a lot more newspapers than I did when I was teaching because I have a little bit more time. And I rail at the TV set a lot. My husband says that probably should turn it off more often, but he's in the media too, so he understands that. And definitely in issues, mostly through social justice activities in our community right now. Hunger, you can offer programs for helping people get food, like food pantries. Okay. But the other side of it is, how in the world do they get in a position where in a country like ours they don't have money for food if they need the money for like medicine or health care? That's just out of whack. So I think there's that level of what we would have called over the years charity, would just simply there'll always be people who have needs, but then there's that other side that says, but why? And we just helped raise a bunch of money for DACA so that I think it was the Radical Notion.
Yes.
Yeah. And they knew where to push a button, and so a bunch of us got together and helped them raise some money.
That's good. Yeah. Do you think, so maybe when you were teaching here as well, had there been any sort of evolution or change in the way that these issues were dealt with?
I was trying to think of how many women were on faculty when I came. And I couldn't find the year that I actually, 79, 80. That's funny because that was the first yearbook I helped advise. But when in the 1979 yearbook, I found 8 faculty members. And I chuckled about this a little bit because 2 of them were in physical education. And now how many women are in physical education?
Yeah, I would have thought.
But the AD is a female. So, when it comes to coaches and stuff, it's kind of interesting to see how that all worked through. Back then, most of the women were in education, but there was one woman in the English department, and I think one in math, and she was unique in many ways. But my mentor, when I first came here, because his office was next to mine in a building where we had to move because one of the other buildings fell down. I was in a building with math and computer science and psychology. Was a math professor who really wanted me to meet one of his former students. And Mary Wheat Gray, at that time, was a professor at American University in Washington, and she had helped someone put together a case about women's pensions, the Natalie Norris case, because she had the actuarial information to do that as a mathematician. And they said, well, you can't use this in a suit because you're not a lawyer. So she went back and got a law degree and passed the bar in D.C. and argued it before the Supreme Court and won. She was a Hastings College grad.
Wow.
And I got to meet her, and she became the head of Amnesty International.
Really?
And Alpha Chi, which was our honorary here, we chose her as a national alumni winner one year and blew everybody away because they didn't realize it. Alpha Chi has a lot of fairly small colleges and universities as its members. Phi Beta Kappa tends to have the big universities.
Okay.
But to have somebody like Mary Brandon, we were so proud she was from Hastings College. And I said, so what happened as a part of that is that this math prof was proud of his female students. And so, I got to meet them, and we got to push them forward a little bit in some ways that we hadn't done before. And there were some great role models in the female faculty, absolutely wonderful people. And I think there are more faculty now that are female.
Yeah, I think so.
In all areas.
So around it.
Yeah.
When you were teaching here, was there anything that particularly stuck out for you? Say a news story or an issue that was...
Anything. In 37 years. I don't know. When I first came back to teach, the college was in a financial exigency situation. And I remember being only vaguely aware of it because I was hired as an interim instructor, not even an instructor. And I served in that position for 2 years. So it became clear to me, and it was fine with me at that time, that my position was tenuous because they weren't hiring anybody, and the faculty was having to decide, how do we grow and who are we and where does the liberal arts fit in the future. And it was a tremendous effort by teachers from all disciplines to create a conscious image of the liberal arts education and where Hastings College fit in that. So I sort of basked in that system of faculty togetherness and growth and commitment to each other, not just to people in their own department.
Yeah.
But one of my colleagues in the English department, because it was still a combined department at the time, was a former basketball player, and he was just as supportive as Mike Trader, being a basketball coach, and how important it was that those basketball players learned to read novels and appreciate. I mean, there was a lot of high regard for that outside of your own discipline. And it had been a part of my DNA as a student, too. We all got together. So those years, particularly in the 80s into the 90s, were just pretty powerful years of seeing faculty members who took a very serious role in improving everything about the campus experience, and not kind of assigning it, well, we'll hire an administrator to do that. And I remember my dad saying that he knew a lot of friends in Fremont from Midland University, and he said not one of them would have ever done all these recruiting trips you people do.
Okay.
He said they've got admissions people to do that, but he says you guys keep talking about going off and meeting all these students, and I said you go off to England and get people, and I said well yeah, I said that's what we do. And I was as willing to talk to a person who wanted biology as a major as I was to someone who wanted journalism or English, because we all supported the concept of each other, but we also knew how incredibly important it was to recruit. I mean, that's a fact of life. We're a tuition-driven institution. Yeah. And to be a part of that family, if you will, of respect. We didn't all agree on things. Heavens. Some of the best discussions you'll ever see blow up in a room will be with academics, but usually they simmer and then they go on with their lives or they find another place to teach. But there was always that sense that the academic experience in a liberal arts tradition was important enough to nurture, and so we did. No, it's pretty good. Pretty good stuff. And they supported international education, even when it was tough, it got tougher and tougher to do. We figured out, I mean, I sat down with someone at admissions and figured out the entire insurance thing, and neither one of us knew anything about insurance.
No.
But we knew all of a sudden it was important, and when someone like you came, there was no question that your health would be cared.
Yeah.
And they were going, oh, yeah, probably should do that. Well, yeah. Or you'd have somebody like Anja Anderson.
Yes.
Who says, I don't care whether they've got plans on a weekend, I'll invite them over to my house anyway, and they can say no.
Yeah.
I mean, when I went over to Britain, the first time I got asked, well, how much hospitality do you want? And I go, what do you mean? Hospitality. I don't know how to answer that. But her sense, and others like her, was just do it.
Yeah.
Fix the meal. And people from Germany come, and people from England come, and a few crazy people who want to go there come, and then just let's talk. And it was so much fun to do things with her, and Rob Babcock with the Ireland trip and all that. And from the time I came back all the way until I retired, then I was always advocating for the exchange.
Yeah, there's a big push for it here.
Yeah, and most everybody goes, how do you say that again? Leicester.
Leicester.
Yeah. And I said, and if you haven't been there because you're romantically just, Edinburgh and London are the only two places in the world, then let me tell you about the wonderful, the middle of England. Now, you're probably not from Leicester yourself,
No,
right?
I'm from Southampton.
Southampton, and I've been there.
Yeah, have you actually?
Mm-hmm.
It's fantastic. Oh, wow, I like it.
Yes, yes.
South Coast it's one of the weird things that you get in England that you don't get here, is that you're never ever far from the sea.
Do you feel like you've got to go find water once in a while?
So far away from the ocean. I didn't realise how much I missed seagulls, which is bizarre because I wasn't aware that I was so aware of seagulls until I came here.
They're just everywhere. Absolutely. Yeah. I walked Cornwall.
Yeah.
Over my Christmas holidays.
Yeah.
Walked it.
I wonder how.
With a crazy student from Oregon, and she and I just bought a backpack. We started at Tintagel.
Yeah.
And then walked all the way around the coast. Of course, nobody else is out doing this kind of stuff.
The English people definitely aren't, isn't it?
But they were so nice.
Yeah.
And of course, we were totally off season, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, why were you doing this? People are having, lambs in their pubs, and we were going in and go, oh, this is cool. They're thinking, well, that's what we do in our pubs in the off season. We have the lambing. You guys are just crazy.
Very weird. Yeah.
But we loved it. And we ended up around in the Southampton area, where a friend of ours from the University of Virginia was also a Rotary student, and he was going to school there, so we spent a few days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How interesting.
Yeah, well, Weymouth was one of my favorite places to take my mom.
I really like Weymouth.
Yeah.
It's my mother's auntie, so great auntie that lived there.
So how did you end up coming here? I mean, do you have any contact with Nebraska?
No, not at all. I thought, in general terms, that it was in the middle, so if I wanted to travel, I could.
Okay.
That it would be cheap and it wouldn't be touristy.
Yes, that's for sure.
I didn't want to tourist it,
Yep, and you can still get on Amtrak. It's not as fast as anything in England, but you can get to Denver.
It's quite nice to look outside, I suppose, on a slow train.
Yeah.
And I was really interested in just the experience of a place that didn't have these sort of certain factors that big cities had. Which was you get 4 choices. Mm-hmm. You get and you pick, and then they value everyone's choices, and your statement, I only picked Hastings. If I wasn't going to Hastings, I wasn't going to do the trip.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. That's great.
It's the same way with my university. When I had the choice I only put Leicester down. I didn't put it. If I wasn't going to Leicester, I wasn't going to university.
And that's a long way from Seagulls on the average day.
Yeah.
But there are a few that brave it in there and eat up a little grain on his fields.
You get on a train and be from the seaside and out.
Yeah, you can get about anywhere from Leicester pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's a good city. Can I just say, thank you ever so much.
You've got class.
Oh, no. Just
okay.
I want to carry on talking to you, but thank you ever so much for doing this for me. And
you're welcome.
I would like to say thank you, and